I'd love to just give a little bit of overview for those who aren't aware of what the Presidential Precinct is. And I want to first start with what we believe in and why we build programs for visionary leaders like the Mandela Washington Fellows that are with us. And that's really comes to the heart that we believe that young people can, with a strong vision, can transform their communities and create more thriving, just, and free societies. And we do this through our 6-partner organization, which brings together the University of Virginia, College of William and Mary, the homes of 3 founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson's Monticello, James Madison's Montpelier, James Monroe's Highland, and then William Short's Morven. And through these institutions, we invest in future heads of states and prime ministers, civil society leaders, and entrepreneurs, and help provide new skills and perspectives and connections to really move communities forward. And so we're honored to be host for the 5th year of the Mandela Washington Fellowship program. And the purpose of MWF Live is really to share your voice and the work and the change that you're seeing in your communities. What are some of those challenges? What are some of the opportunities? What's working? What's not? What can we learn from your experience? And today we're broadcasting live from James Madison's Montpelier, and we've got a big important topic at hand today, and that's advancing rule of law. And Nancy Hopkins is going to guide us through that. Nancy's the Director of Programs at the Presidential Precinct. And so Nancy, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Neil. We do have a big topic to cover here today in the next hour. This issue of rule of law is one that's kind of hard to get your hands around, especially in the time that we've got. And there are lots of ideas out there about what it is and how it works in different country contexts. I think before our panelists introduce themselves, which we definitely want to get into, maybe I'll just offer up a definition that we've been considering this morning, actually, with some colleagues from the Center for Teaching of Rule of Law out of Roanoke College in Salem, Virginia. Our colleagues were positing that rule of law is really about a rights-bound society, perhaps one that has 4 basic principles: consent of the governed, limited government, obedience to the law, and an independent judiciary. And through these 4 principles, governments guarantee to citizens qualities like fairness, stability, and equality, things that are very important to quality of life and to a vibrant democracy. So it'll be interesting to see how some of these features play out in your work or don't play out, different definitions in your country. So looking really forward to getting into that today. Just a bit about the format. We'll have some facilitated questions here in the beginning where we'll hear from our panelists about their passions and about their work. And then we'll turn to our physical and our virtual audience and take your questions, because I know that the insights and perspectives of our colleagues will spark a lot of ideas in your minds as well. So we look forward to taking those questions after our moderated discussion. First, I would love for each of our panelists to say a bit about themselves and about their work back home.
Thank you, Nancy. Okay, thanks for all those who are watching, especially from my home country, Cameroon. Nice to have you on board. I'm Clifford Akonteh. I'm a barrister at law from Cameroon. I'm actually the national coordinator for the Movement for Democracy, Development and Transparency, with acronym MDDT Cameroon. And it's a human rights and peace-building organization that works on access to justice with focus on young people. I'm also the Central African Executive Director for the Youth Alliance for Leadership and Development in Africa, with acronym YALDA. It is actually founded in Harvard by ex-Harvard African students. It exists in 40 African universities and in 26 African countries. We actually build platforms and have interactive forums to engage youth in politics, entrepreneurship, and for them to empower themselves. I have a passion for engaging youth in politics.
Hi everyone, my name is Lwazi Mtshiyo. I'm a human rights lawyer and community activist in South Africa, but more so community activist. I work on land and housing rights issues and spatial justice issues in South Africa. Most of my work really involves a lot of mobilization and politics. But when talking politics, we're not talking party politics, but we're talking issue-based kind of politics. Politics that say, I want water, I want electricity.
Thank you, Nancy. My name is Edith Bishi. I'm from Zimbabwe. I'm a practicing lawyer, but I have a passion for women's rights. In that regard, I work with women's rights organizations to complement access to justice through provision of legal aid, legal representation, and legal education to indigent women in the rural and marginalized communities in Zimbabwe.
Thank you, Nancy, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nerima. I am a human rights lawyer and women's rights activist from Kenya. I work in an organization that focuses on the right to health. It's known as KELIN, the Kenya Legal and Ethical Issues Network on HIV and AIDS, and I focus on the reproductive health and rights of women and girls, and I also teach law at the University of Nairobi as a tutorial fellow.
Good. Thank you so much. We look forward to hearing from each of you. I think I'll direct this first question to all four panelists. And it's really about kind of your personal story. What motivated you to become a lawyer and specifically to focus on human rights rather than other fields of law? You certainly could have gone in other directions with your law degree. Was it something that you always intended to do, or did you have an aha moment when you felt that that the law was the best way to achieve your mission and your purpose in life? Tell us a bit about your journey. Maybe we could start with you, Nerima.
Yeah, I have the mic, so. Well, actually, it wasn't so much an aha moment, more than I was very indecisive before I chose the specific career because I was 17 and I was trying to decide between law, between medicine, lots of things. And when you're that young, you think you can do everything. So I didn't really know what I wanted to do up until I got into class, my first day at university in a law class, and it just dawned on me that this makes sense. This is where I really need to be, and it really did make sense. Why I chose to focus on human rights law was after university, I was working at the Land Claims Court in South Africa. And in my experience, I worked there for about 2 years. And my experience there just really showed me just how apartheid had dehumanized so many people. And having to watch families and communities come before the court and almost like beg for something that they should have. It was so painful to see it continuously and see people writing papers and letters and just pleading and just trying to get a way that they could get their dignity back from that period of their lives. That just really showed me that there must be a different way to do these things. How we're doing it isn't right, and human rights might be a way to challenge some of the structures that we have that do this to people.
For me, I would call it an extraordinary calling. I've always wanted to help the people, to assist the women, to be the lawyer for the people. So I figured that the law would actually equip me or to arm me with the necessary knowledge and the skills to assist the people in the remote communities with the legal assistance that they would need. Why human rights specifically? It's because human rights law pervades all the other legal disciplines. So by studying human rights law, I'll be able to assist people in the immigration, labor, and constitutional law. Thank you.
Okay. In fact, with me, I was never interested in the law. Just to start with, I was actually interested in politics themselves. I think given the history of South Africa and how the law was actually used to dispossess people and put them in disadvantaged position, so there's always a negative position that that we held against the law. So I was interested particularly in how people organize and mobilize and find justice within themselves in our small communities. And in the context of being a rural folk, was that it would be a headman who would lead those discussions and find the voice in a manner that was very inclusive. And I think what's very interesting is how horizontal or how flat that structure is in terms of participation. Now, it cultured me not only in the sense of understanding currently inclusivity in the sense of the Western sense, but in a very strong traditional sense, because in those spaces, even though they were viewed as being traditional, but everyone actually equally participated. So I think, obviously, when it came to the academic side, geography wasn't going to cut it. So naturally, I had to choose a career that would actually assist in advancing community struggles. And I didn't think of myself beyond thinking the legal profession. And currently, I still I'm very strongly into community work, and I always call myself a community activist who moonlights as a lawyer.
Okay, as for me, actually, when I was very young, I wanted to become the Pope. And with time, my motivation is actually my father's political story. My father is one of the Cameroonians who actually fought for multipartism in the 1990s. He's one of those rare, morally oriented politicians that I look up to. And I watched him the way he fought for his people. I watched him get arrested. I watched him abandon his family, his beloved wife and children, and sleep in the bushes. Just because, even though he wasn't a lawyer, he wanted to be the voice of his people. That was a great motivation for me. He actually encouraged me to study the law. He got me registered in Abuja Law School, but I refused to go because I couldn't see myself one day abandoning my family. I tried business and it didn't work. And I finally had a job, and I faced a lot of injustices that reminded me of what my father went through. And that was the aha moment. I thought it was the right time to look for a career that was going to talk for those who didn't have an opportunity in life, for those children who didn't have a place in life. Being the voice of the voiceless, I found out two main professions, and that was going to be journalist or going to be the law. And so I saw that my dad was right. And I continue to tell myself I didn't make a mistake because his legacy must live on. And that is my courage.
Thank you so much for sharing your personal stories and a bit of your journey with us. So let's get into a discussion of some of the challenges to the rule of law. We all have them, including here in the United States. Perhaps I could get into this question with Lwazi and Nerima. What are some of the specific challenges you see, maybe grounded in examples from your work, challenges to the rule of law in your country? Is it weak legal frameworks, or is it a problem of enforcement, or is there not widespread understanding of what the laws are, or are certain members of society less likely to receive equal treatment? What are some examples from your work that can help us make some of these challenges vivid for us?
Okay, thank you, Nes. One of the biggest challenges we have is not the existence of the laws. It's actually the implementation of the laws that exist. For example, I work with land and housing that's protected in terms of our constitution. And given our painful history of dispossession, of being landless, so you have sufficient provisions in the constitution to make sure that there is a balance within the current constitutional dispensation of making sure that there's partial justice and land reform. But what has been lacking is the actual implementation of those laws. I'll give you an example. There are many cases. I don't want to cite one specific one. When we're talking about the obligation that sits with government in South Africa, where they have to give land back to the people in a constitutionally confined or conforming manner, that has not been happening. In fact, what you've had is a lot of evictions that have been led by government, even in terms of private property owners that actually lead evictions, where government owes a constitutional obligation to provide temporary alternative accommodation. Government simply abandons those responsibilities. Now, here's a question. For many people who are dispossessed, unlawfully so, because there's a procedure that could be used to actually evict people, but government doesn't follow that procedure. Now, the question becomes, what happens then in a situation where government leads unlawful evictions when it should be tasked with enforcing the laws in the right manner? And then on the other hand, it's leading evictions, but it's actually charged with the constitutional obligation of balancing and making sure that people realize those rights. Are you not eroding the confidence in the law and the constitution and so forth? One of the examples that examples I like to cite is that with these institutions that exist, one of the things I always say to our clients is that Once you are evicted, actually use the law and go and say you've been unlawfully evicted, because it's actually a criminal charge. But some clients would say to me, well, that's a joke, because in fact, people were leading the evictions in cooperation with government, were law enforcement officers. The question then becomes, who whips the whip?
So I think now would be a good time to put the disclaimer that I am a feminist. So I have the same answer as Lwazi, but a different take on it. So the huge challenge is actually implementation. We have like a lot of laws. When we talk about this all the time, like our parliament, I would say, has been thriving. Since we got our new constitution, parliament has been on it. They've been writing laws. They've been doing a lot in terms of putting together a legal framework. But there's a question of legitimacy, because we have a two-thirds gender rule in our country, which means that Parliament should not be composed of more than 2/3 of any particular gender. That has never been implemented. And it's been a long battle around that. But then we have a lot of the times where you have all these laws that are coming out and they seem wonderful and they seem gender neutral. But when it comes to implementation or when it comes to practice, you start to see the problems. You start to see the issues. I can just specify one law we have. The Sexual Offences Act, which was actually passed before our constitution. And we're very excited about it because we do have a lot of sexual violence within the country. So we're very excited about the Sexual Offences Act. But then we had a specific section, Section 38, that criminalized lying about sexual violence. So lying about it. So it criminalized it. And on the face of it, it seems very normal. No one wants somebody to lie about a law, about like an offense, obviously, because it affects somebody else's life. But in reality, why was it necessary? Because we have a provision for perjury. So if you say anything under oath that's a lie, you will be caught by that. So why was it necessary? And it was necessary because when you went back to read the records, when the parliament was passing the law, there's this concept that women lie about sexual violence. So we need to work towards protecting perpetrators from women who lie. So seemingly gender-neutral provisions often have a very malignant element in them, and if you don't really look at it through a gender lens, you will lose it. So the laws are there, but who's passing them? And those that are passing them, do they really, really understand the demographics of the people? And they can't. If you have a 70% male parliament, they're not going to understand women's issues. They might want to. They might say that they do, but they won't fully ever understand it. And that's why we had the two-thirds gender rule in our constitution, but we've really had a difficult time implementing it up until today. But to be fair, the constitution is only 8 years old, so we're working on it. But it's not really lack of a legal framework, it's legitimacy of a legal framework and implementation of that illegitimate framework.
Interesting. Thank you for some of those examples about implementation having to do with the process, but also who is implementing, and this issue that you raised also of sort of inherent bias that may go into some of these frameworks and how they're implemented. So I think that is a good segue perhaps to our next question, this one for Edith and Clifford. You often hear folks talk about building a culture of rule of law, which also is a very vague but seemingly important concept. What does that look like in your country? How does one go about building a culture of respect for the rule of law? I was talking to one of your fellows, and they were teasing me actually that they had been in Charlottesville standing at a crossroads, and there were no cars around, but there was a small group of Americans waiting patiently for the walk sign to go on, even though there were no cars around, and they said that was interesting. So that's maybe a silly but micro example of respect for rule of law. And of course, we do have our own challenges in our country with rule of law, but I thought that was an interesting conversation. So how do you build trust among citizens that rule of law is for the benefit of all and a key part of having a democracy and a civil society? How can you shift some assumptions and mindsets and behaviors?
Regarding the Zimbabwean context, I would look at it in view of the Robert Mugabe era vis-a-vis the new dispensation. Well, it is common cause that during the Robert Mugabe era, we didn't have a good history of the respect for the rule of law. There were so many human rights violations. The judiciary was not independent. Well, the list is endless. Now, looking at the current dispensation, I would say that yes, efforts have been made towards the fulfilling of the respect, or rather the culture for the respect of the rule of law in our country. There has been independence of the judiciary, so to say. The court decisions themselves have been respected currently in Zimbabwe. But then I guess maybe the litmus test might be with the upcoming elections. How do you then shift mindsets? Well, I would say that the fish starts to rot from the top, going to the bottom. So the leaders themselves, the powers that be, must respect rule of law. There must be independence of the judiciary. There must be separation of powers. In other words, there must be checks and balances. If the judiciary is independent, it means there is respect and promotion for human rights. But then again, I would shift the burden to the citizens themselves, the citizens of Zimbabwe. There must be active participation in the law reform-making process so that there is a culture of respect for the rule of law and human rights as a whole.
Okay, thank you very much. I always like to start my discussions with a joke. Vis-a-vis your example, I would just like to ask if the lights are actually working before you have to know whether you're crossing or not. So, Africa and the world at large is gradually shifting timidly from the rule by law to the rule of law. The rule by law is actually where the law is actually an instrument by the government, but not for the government. The rule of law is very basic. Everyone is held accountable, including the government. Africa and the world at large is in this shift. The rule of law is gradually seeming like a myth, and we need to accept that and put efforts to move. I appreciate one of my idols, Kofi Annan. In his 2004 report at the UN General Assembly, he was very keen on the rule of law, and he makes it clear the rule of law is for all persons, all entities, all institutions, public or private, for the government, in conformity with international norms for the respect of human rights. He talks about the independence of the judiciary, equality, participation, and all sorts of, which is very important. I come now to the Cameroonian concept. Cameroon is not an exception to the shift. Just like any other country or any other African country, it's timid. And I would not like to base myself talking really about how the culture is in Cameroon, because it's obvious that it's a general culture of timidity across the world. I would like to base my talk on what needs to be done for that culture to be improved. We have to look at legal literacy. Legal literacy must go down to the roots, must go down to the local people. Not everyone interprets and understands the law. The law has to be basic. The law has to reach the common man in a language that he or she understands. Governments need to work with lawyers, bar associations, journalists, the media, to make this a reality. Another very important point that we must note when it comes to the rule of law is access to justice. Access to justice. Separation of powers. Independence of the judiciary. Our constitutions are so sweet. They have so sweet words to describe this. But is it implemented? It's just a shadow. There must exist the political will to make this happen. The independence of the judiciary is paramount for the rule of law to be possible. Another thing is electoral integrity. How fair are the elections? Elections are pushing societies into conflict. If the election is not fair, if it's not transparent, how do people trust the political system? What is the meaning of fairness? Fairness begins with you and I. Fairness begins with registering and participation to vote. Fairness begins with you, the youth, running for elections. Fairness begins with responsibility of protecting your votes. Fairness comes with an independent electoral system. Fairness comes to ensure that there's a conducive environment for voting. Without fairness, the rule of law is a sham. I've spoken enough about conflict. Something that seems impossible, but I think the world needs to do for this culture to exist is the respect for journalists and lawyers. The world needs to give that respect to journalists and lawyers because they are the voice of the voiceless. The common man needs no other person than the journalists and the lawyers first. You give immunity to parliamentarians, senators. You despise the lawyer. You despise the journalists. There's no rule of law without the journalist and the lawyer. We need to shift from giving immunity to the powers that cannot be held accountable to those that are always with the people. Civil society activists must be respected. They risk their lives to give back to society. The world needs that respect for them. When it comes to shifting the mindset, it comes with political will. And for the young people, it starts with you. You need to change the definition of wisdom for the old. Wisdom for the old existed because there was no communication, no education. But now as young people, you can grab a lot of experience intellectually and in the field by volunteering to become wise like Macron. So thank you very much.
Good. Thank you for those perspectives. Powerful words from Edith about a top-down and bottom-up approach, both needed, and then this critical issue of the political will and the boldness, really, to turn those sweet words, as you put it, into a reality and to convert that into concrete commitment. So thinking more about this idea of a bottom-up approach, actually, to Lwazi and Edith, back to you again. So Lwazi, you're working full-time with a nonprofit social justice organization in Cape Town. And Edith, I know that outside your full-time job, you're doing lots of volunteer work with women's rights organizations in a pro bono capacity. What role do you think that civil society organizations can play in promoting access to justice for marginalized groups and promoting the rule of law? What can be done reasonably from the outside to shift this culture and to turn those words into reality? And what are some of the most strategic things that you're seeing in your work that NGOs are doing?
Okay, thank you, Nancy. Firstly, I think civil society needs to constantly check itself and make a conscious decision never to replace people's struggles with their own ideas of what people's struggles mean. So it's a constant struggle sometimes because we have ideas and we work with communities. We should rather take an approach that says we work to complement people's struggles and advance them rather than replace them. I'll talk, for example, in the context of access to justice. Access to justice doesn't mean access to lawyers. And sometimes you can actually erode and take a lot from people by representing them. So you should always make a conscious decision that you're there for a lawyer. It's one aspect of it, of assisting communities. And in all realities, people's struggles cannot only be assisted by the law. They'll always be assisted by the people. Particularly if you look at the law itself. If, for example, I'm talking in the context of evictions and people who get evicted, most of the people are people who don't have money, because how we define access to justice is access to lawyers. And they are more likely not to get a lawyer, but rely on each other in terms of advancing their own struggles and resisting against those unlawful evictions. So there needs to be a deliberate effort that's ongoing to make sure that you never replace those struggles. It's rather to advance and assist those struggles. Just a bit to talk a bit also in terms of freedom of expression, as well as the right to protest. Some of the cases that I've done were particularly around what we call fees must fall in South Africa, where students stood up and said, we're tired of escalating fees. We can no longer afford to pay university fees, and therefore we are shutting down. We want to protest and demonstrate. There's one thing that's funny about the law. I think everyone likes the law when it favors them. But I think in this context, the many people who've always said to me, we like the work that you're doing when you're supporting communities to protest. They now have water, they now have electricity. But what's interesting about what I was assisting students with here was actually the fundamental of access to education. And now if you think of access to education, particularly, I think this cuts across the world. Access to education speaks to people who are privileged. In the South African context, it probably means white and the middle class that has accumulated wealth in post-apartheid South Africa. Now, the same people were very critical of the kind of work that they do, simply because now you're talking education, because that's where their kids go. And in the context of water, whether people get water or electricity, it doesn't really directly affect them. So I think when we're thinking of the law itself, we should not only think about when it assists us, we should also think about how it takes us out and challenges our own values and what we see as personal gain, but also assisting the person across the room. You can think about marginalized communities. People always pick up their own morals and old ethics when actually the law is protecting a minority who enjoys equal protection of the law.
Well, from what Lwazi has said, it seems as if the civil society organizations really play a fundamental role to advance democracy within the African states. Civil society also increase accountability and contribute to good governance within African states. The work the civil society organizations within Zimbabwe are doing towards promoting access to justice are quite commendable. In my country, the civil society organizations are in a consortium to ensure that every Monday to Friday at the magistrates court, there is actually a lawyer who is there to assist the citizens of Zimbabwe by providing legal advice and also legal drafting at the courts. The civil society organizations also render legal education in communities, remote communities within and within Zimbabwe. Civil society organizations also provide legal representation actually in court for the citizens who are in need of legal representation. The civil society organizations as well, they also participate in the law reform making process. They also participate in the drafting of shadow reports and they submit those shadow reports, for example, to CEDAW. So it is actually quite commendable that the civil society organizations are actually making contributions towards the fundamental respect for the rule of law.
Great, thank you for delineating out some of those different roles and also for that important reminder to keep the interests of communities front and center and not to make it about the organization or about the lawyers. I think that's a good reminder to all of us. I wanted to go back to something that Clifford touched on, which is the issue of youth. And that's an issue we're talking about here today at Montpelier, is how do you engage youth in effective ways in a conversation about promoting the rule of law. So Nerima and Clifford, you both are working closely with youth in your country. What does youth engagement on rule of law look like in your context? What are you personally and your organizations doing on this, on issues related to law and legal protection? And does working with youth give you hope about the future of rule of law in your respective countries?
Okay. When it comes to my organization, that is the Movement for Democracy, Development and Transparency, I actually pilot a project branded Not Too Young to Vote. And the Not Too Young to Vote project is geared towards advocating for fairness and transparency in elections. is trying to build a platform of over 2 million young Cameroonians so that they can come together and strategize on how to engage in democratic processes and run for offices. So we, in the past months, we have used our YALDA branches in the universities, like University of Boya, University of Bamenda, the SWA University in Yaoundé, and we have young leaders where we have built this platform for us to hold workshops, have true cultural events to be able to change mindsets and convince young people that the vote is louder than the gun. It's a very technical moment in my country right now where we have a little bit of a crisis, an Anglophone crisis. And so we need to really engage young people to change their mindsets, knowing that getting to the ballot box is actually a possibility. And that is what getting change through the ballot box is a possibility. And that is what MDDT is actually advocating for right now. But this can happen if there is no fairness. We need to have a conducive environment so that fairness can be there when elections are going on. The government needs to create that environment. Dialogue, we need dialogue. It's a great power. Dialogue is louder than the use of force. So we actually call on African governments to especially in Central Africa, it is very paramount for us to learn how to dialogue. The voices, even in the Bible, are louder and more spiritual than the gun. And when it comes to access to justice, the Movement for Democracy also works with young lawyers. We built a platform of young lawyers, bringing them together. We have an advocacy project for decriminalization of petty offenses. I give you an example. You don't need to be criminalized for not paying house rent, because it's obvious that the tort, civil law has already taken care of that. You don't need to criminalize it. Besides, we have a rigid budget and a justice system that does not reach out to the communities. Not criminalizing very little offenses, like indecent dressing and all of that, is going to get the prisons full. And it is very difficult to handle those prisons. It also gives room for corruption with the police and military, because they always want to use for the least reason to arrest. And obviously, there's a threat on bail being free. So that's one of the projects that we're engaging, getting juries and young people together. Also, we have literacy programs where we go out to local societies and talk to traditional rulers, and we get volunteers from the university in the university communities to try to reach out to young people right out there to break down the terms of adjectival and substantive law, bring it to their level so that they understand procedures, especially when they are harassed or when they are caught with some injustices back in their community. So those are some of the basic things that we do.
Thanks for the question. So I actually work with the young people in two capacities. As a teacher, all my students are very young. And in my organization, which works on the right to health, we focus on the reproductive health and rights of women, of adolescent girls and young women. So basically from 15 to 24. And one of the things that I realized when I first started this work was the spaces in which you engage girls and women shows you how they see themselves and how society sees them and how they internalize that. So when we would start our discussions, we would be asking, what do you want to be? And more often than not, we'd get two answers. Teacher and nurse, like across two counties, across different society, just teacher and nurse. And I wondered, like, why just teacher and nurse? And the more you speak with them, you realize this is the only two options they've ever been given that they can be. And they've internalized that I can only be a teacher and a nurse. So we try to use the law to show them, you aren't what society makes you to be. You can be so much more than that, because even if you look at the Bill of Rights in our context, there's no every boy, every girl, every man. It's every person. And every person has his rights, and every person has this dignity. And you have to see yourself within the context of every person and stop limiting your potential to what you've been told you are, but to really what you can be. So most of the focus is on building the capacity of adolescent girls and young women, helping them to see themselves in different spaces, helping them to understand their rights in a way that they can actually take charge of their own autonomy, helping them to understand that you need to be in these different spaces. For me, it's really exciting when working with young people because you see the shift. It's actually quite easy to see the shift from somebody who just thought this of themselves to maybe a year later, somebody who is sitting in different spaces and really working towards building themselves, but their own community. And young people are usually very passionate about their communities and building their communities. There's a tendency for them to want to give back. So all the girls we work with, after we finish our sessions, they'll be like, please give us some material. I want to take this back home. I want to reach other girls. So it's always a concept of there's something that you're seeing shifting in yourself and you want to give it to other people. And we found that that is very fundamental in the work that we do. And we use the law to show them nothing distinguishes you from boys. So why are you doing it to yourself? Why are you letting society tell you that you're different?
Great, thank you for those examples. I think that gives all of us hope, certainly for the future in your countries, but more broadly. I'm keeping one eye on the clock. I would love to turn to some questions, actually, from Facebook Live, but also from our audience here at Montpelier. So maybe I'll ask two questions that we pulled off the Facebook Live stream, and feel free to answer whichever one appeals or whichever one you think you'd like to dig into. Javier from Mozambique is concerned about disregard for human rights violations, concerned about violence in the face of war, lack of freedom of the press, lack of respect for the right to protest. What can be done? What should be done in the face of those overt violations of human rights? So that's a question from Mozambique. The second, from Brandon in Botswana. So as lawyers and human rights activists, in any of your work, are you also advocating for and assisting to promote the rights of LGBTI people in your communities? So please feel free to answer whichever question you want to weigh in on. So.
Oh, okay, I have the mic again, so. Okay, so I'll answer the second question because I feel like Clifford might be better placed for the first one. When it comes to LGBTIQ communities, actually my organization works directly with them within the context of their right to health. So it's normally a very difficult push and pull because we still have a penal code that criminalizes certain communities. Sex workers, men who have sex with men, they are criminalized within our penal code, but we really try to ground our work around understanding what a fundamental right is and how you can distinguish it. So fundamentally, we look at how our constitution is framed, and it says every person. So it doesn't say every straight, every heterosexual, just every person. And using that, we argue with the Ministry of Health, with the courts, that you cannot distinguish anyone from health services. And that's usually our foundation. As long as it's a health service, everyone must be able to access it, no matter how you perceive them or how you perceive their conduct or what their behavior is. We really hope that this would obviously build the discourse around whether or not you can ever judge sexual orientation or it should ever be a question of law. But as a starting point is, which rights in the Constitution belong to anyone? None. They are there for every person. And given that they are people within our borders, what right do we have to distinguish them from others on the basis of their ability to access healthcare?
I'll answer the other question on human rights violations. The human rights violations are actually an indication that the struggle is real in the field of human rights. So we need human rights lawyers who are able to actually defend the fundamental rights and freedoms of citizens in the constitutional courts within the African states.
Okay. In terms of LGBTQ rights, I always say if you're working with communities, you're working with all issues. Particularly for me, I work where we mobilize and organize and talk to different communities. So it becomes important because we make important decisions in terms of that affect the rest of the community. So it becomes important who sits around the discussion without necessarily interfering with the community structures and representation, but I always make sure that I keep a conscious decision to make sure that's a very inclusive one. I mean, I currently work at Lwazi in Cape Town. It's a very diverse group of people, sexual orientation, gender, and so forth. And we made a conscious effort. Currently, we're engaging in the process of adopting a constitution for the organization. We have specific sections that actually cater for sexual orientation and gender, not to be discriminated on those bases. Just on the other question of the right to protest, I think that's one of the most important things, particularly when you're sitting there as a community. It's one right that you actually use to keep your government in check. It's one right that actually questions the budget of government, where that budget is gone. So once you do away with that right, it means you've removed the only checks and balances that the community has to check whether the authorities themselves are doing what they're obliged to do.
Okay. I think history gives us an opportunity for us to know what violence is and what war is all about. I think it is a very difficult question when it comes to how to tackle violence in communities and conflict. But one thing that young people must know is that time heals. And it starts with you. You take the decision, you make the decision to bring the change. The power of numbers can always bring the change. You can always change the narrative. Life is about solving problems. Violence is just one of them. Violence, getting rid of violence is not an impossibility. Targeting conflict is not an impossibility. Whatever community you come from where there's conflict is just a revolution for change. But you must stand up tall and hold your hands together to preach peace and to make sure that you always write the handwriting on the wall for those who come after you to know that peace is always better than war.
Thank you. I have a couple more questions coming in from the live stream, but why don't we take a question from our live audience here at Montpelier?
Hi, everyone. I have a question that maybe Clifford, Nerima, and Lwazi could help me, or Edith also answer. Clifford spoke about literacy and the importance of literacy, and Lwazi also spoke about access to education. Nerima, you're a teacher and you teach students, young students at school. So you guys would agree with me that education is very important in the application, the respect of the law, but more importantly in the knowledge of the rule of law before everything else. So as lawyers and activists, what role can one play in assuring a better education system in your country? Or in another way, what should or can be done to reduce the gap between education and the knowledge of the law in your country?
This time I have the mic too. So I think one of the critical things that we must note, there's a question that young people always ask, and the question must be changed. That is what the government does for most of these problems. The narrative needs to be changed to what can we do to help the government and make this happen. And that's the role of civil society. That's the role of lawyers. And I think one fundamental thing that we need to do is about educating our communities directly. We are fortunate to have had that knowledge and become experts in our field. In my work, for example, we have MDTT Sparks, which is a newsletter. We try to use it to convince young people to read about our best practices. And unfortunately, we don't have the means to translate it into other languages. But it's always good to work in collaboration, build synergies around local communities. Informal education when it comes to the law is something that we need in local communities. Informal education, adult literacy programs in local communities, to get people. I learned a lot today from the last session on what our peers are doing over here in America, which is about teaching children the rule of law. With ABCD, they have gotten to break boundaries, to start teaching the rule of law right from the basic level. we can also do it in the local communities by building synergies with traditional leaders and through customs.
Yeah, thank you, Tonya. You're actually raising something very important around the education, particularly people understanding what their rights are. What's important, which I think is the backbone of the law itself, is that people need to see themselves in the law. They need to see it applying in their own cases. I want to give you an example of a case we did in the Constitutional Court, which is called Kiribili. In that case, we had about 200 unlawful occupiers who occupied the building. And in terms of the South African law, if you can show to the court that if you are evicted, you're going to be homeless, therefore the state has an obligation to provide you with temporary alternative accommodation. So the community itself understood one thing, even though they did not understand the English and the proceedings of the court. They understood one thing, that they actually had that right, that they can't be kicked out on the street. But on the day they went to court, they asked their local councillor or local representatives to actually articulate or try and translate what was happening in court. So what the local councillor did, he consented to an eviction on their behalf. So ultimately, an eviction order was granted against them, but they ultimately came to us. The reason they came to us is simply because they understood that they can't be kicked out even though there's a court order. But the case itself went on to go and set a precedent in the Constitutional Court whereby it says, even if you've accessed justice, you're already in court. It actually places an obligation on the presiding officer to say, even if you're consenting to your own eviction, the judge must be proactive and be active to ask you enough and say, is this eviction that you're consenting to, are you really sure that you're consenting to it? Are you really sure you understand what the consequences are? So it really comes to the education. If it wasn't for them understanding what their rights are, they would have been evicted. So it's an important thing that you're actually raising.
Thanks, Tanya, for the question. So I have like two answers. One would be what Lwazi said. We need to demystify the law. It shouldn't be some abstract thing far away that people can never get a sense of. One of the things that we work very closely on is building communities' capacities, because they don't have to know every letter of the law, but they have to have a sense of what the law is, what the law says, and what that means for them. And I think how governments have worked in the past is by keeping this some mystical thing, they've been able to use it against their people. Now the law is for us, that's what we've been discussing, the law is for us. So how do you ensure that you don't have to go to law school to understand the law? You don't have to have a law degree to understand the law. You just need to know that there is a constitution somewhere, there is an act somewhere, and it's part of civic education from government that's meant to do that. Government shouldn't be passing legislation without actually asking the people, what do you think about this? How might that affect you in the future? So that if those processes were going on well, it'll be less of a mystical thing and more something that's accessible by everyone. And the second thing I would say is to encourage critical thinking, because a lot of the times there's a huge gap between high school and university, where you've been pretty much taught to cram and pass exams for 12 years, and then suddenly we're asking you, think. And you're like, how? You've never taught me this. So it's really encourage critical thinking, because the law, as I said, is for the people. It needs to be challenged, it needs to be questioned. And that can't happen by people who only know how to regurgitate what they've been told. Because you'll tell them it's what the law says and they'll repeat it to you. They need to be able to be like, that doesn't sound right. That is affecting my sense of justice. How can I change it? So critical thinking needs to be imbued from schools from a very early age. And that really does speak to our education system, at least in Kenya. I don't know about everywhere.
Okay, so my question goes to Nerima and Edith. Based on your work, you work amongst for human rights gender-based, right? Yeah. So in your experience, we have a lot of being talked about sustainable development goals. So in your work, what would you say is the intersection between gender and the rule of law? Because coming from the international perspective, it's focused mainly on women or gender violence, but there's more to it.
Yes, there is definitely more to it. And my disclaimer was I'm a feminist, but I would say that my feminism doesn't necessarily stand on the fact that I feel like we should focus solely on women. We should focus fundamentally on equality and on fundamental equality. So we, a lot of the times in my work, focus on women because of the disadvantage that they have. because a lot of the times they're in a more disadvantaged position than men. But what would be an ideal situation was to have laws and policies, practice, directives that actually speak to every person. So I will just give you my example, because one of the SDGs is quality health, or access to health for all. Where I work in is reproductive health, which is a very problematic issue when it comes to men. Because when we talk about reproductive health for women, it's quite clear. Maternal mortality, access to contraceptives, access to an abortion, these are things that we discuss. There are many challenges, yes, but we discuss. When it comes to men, getting them to discuss their reproductive health is very difficult. Getting men to have good health-seeking behavior is very difficult. So there's some conversations that have been fundamentally changed into conversations about women that actually affect everyone. So it's very necessary to be like, okay, this does affect everyone. And because it's changed into a conversation about women, there's a tendency to pay less attention to it. That's a women's issue, but it's not. Reproductive health affects everyone. And just to be clear, in the same way that you have eggs, you have sperm, and they come from somewhere. So you need to be able to take care of both people, of all people in their reproductive health. So whenever we classify anything as a woman's issue, it tends to divert attention from other people's needs, from other people's challenges around this area. So fundamentally, equality is what we're looking for. Having everybody at the table, having the conversation that affects them.
Yes, there is a distinction, or rather a relationship between the law and between rule of law and gender. Rule of law states that everyone is equal before the law, including the woman and the girl child. Rule of law states that the laws must not discriminate against women. When it comes to the Zimbabwean constitution, yes, the constitution is quite marvelously worded, but what remains a problem is the issue of implementation of the laws that protect and promote the fundamental rights of women.
Thank you. Wanted to turn to another question from the live stream, and this is a tough one, so I'm curious to hear the answer. In terms of advancing rule of law, how do you engage with people in government who may not be interested in reform? What is an effective strategy when you meet with resistance?
Okay, that's actually an area I work in. Firstly, I think in South Africa there's a very strong culture of politics, not party politics, but politics that have come out of frustrations, not services coming to the people. So how people have defined their own politics now, it's issue-based politics. It's people who say if there are elections, they're not going to vote until the road is fixed. So now you're inviting government and also creating spaces for you to engage government, because clearly the invited spaces have not worked. So those are some of the tactics that people use to engage government. One of the things is also that people are this is why it's very important to protect the right to protest and demonstrate. This is one of the means that people use to demonstrate and show their frustration against government. But of course, it's politically contested and charged spaces. It requires a lot of backbone. And also it comes back to why it is important to never be the struggle, but advance people's struggle and represent people's struggles, because people will always tell you how they want to advance their struggle. Rather, you complement that struggle. It's one of the most important things. Keep an ear on the ground and reflect what people's interests are.
So that question, I would say litigation. Go to the courts and sue. That's what we do. But yeah, there's different ways to do it. Realistically, you won't find a government that's just all, oh well, let me help you. That's not, you're not going to come back by that every day. So each day you have to understand that you have a struggle and you have to find a way to make that struggle work. One thing that I know works is trying to negotiate on an almost consistent basis. So whenever we had a case about HIV and a public list with students and pregnant women, I mean, the government at that time was really trying to put a directive forward to help women, to help people living with HIV, particularly children and women, pregnant mothers, to ensure that they get services. But they wanted to publish the names in order to do that, without regard to privacy, without regard to the stigma issues around HIV. So in that process, we went to the government in so many different ways. We went to the Ministry of Health. We wrote to the Office of the Presidency. We reached out to the Commission of Administrative Justice. We reached out to very many different commissions, which all agreed with us. And like published things in the newspaper, we wrote, we begged, we pleaded. They didn't listen, and then we went to court. So by the time we went to court, we had like a clear record of all attempts to reach out to the government and get a sort of response from them. So the court was like, well, you guys were clearly told severally what the issues are going to be, so you really have tied our hands. So I think negotiation does play a part of it, but you need to also know when negotiation isn't taking you further, what do you need to do next? Do you want to go to court? Do you want to go to the streets? You have to have a plan B and never just rely on somebody just happily giving you what you asked for, because that hardly ever happens.
Other strategies for overcoming resistance?
Yeah, I think it's simple. It's just to keep walking. Just to keep walking. Just like Martin Luther King says, if you can run, you walk. If you can walk, you crawl. And so it's just to keep walking.
Maybe just one last question before we close. I know there are lots of young people who are inspired by what they're hearing today and maybe thinking about careers in human rights law. What advice do you have for the future human rights defenders of your country? Any words of inspiration or words of wisdom to pass on?
I have a little bad news for you. But the actual thing I have to say is that there's no sweet without sweat. And interesting one I got during one of our sessions, there's no resurrection without crucifixion. And I have tried to coin it in 2 words. For you to reap, you must end it. End means that you have to endure. You have to be non-violent. You have to decide. Reap, you need to be responsible. You need to be innovative, and you have to participate.
Yeah, firstly, I think it's a very difficult thing. It takes a lot of personal sacrifice. Those are the realities that come with it. It also, I think, creates your own identity in terms of how society views you. But it's a very rewarding thing because you're really advancing people's struggles in communities. And there's a lot of interest that come from it. And I think it's a self-fulfilling journey as well. And the nice thing is that with human rights law, even if you don't like it at some point, the law does give you the kind of power to participate in other structures and forms, even if it's not necessarily the law itself. But the net is wide enough and open for you to cast it wider beyond that's just human rights.
When one turns to the field of human rights, the struggle is real. But we need people like you who will be able to actually sometimes make a sacrifice so that they can promote the common good and respect for the fundamental human rights of individuals.
I would say the law is one tool for activism. It's not the only tool. I have met a lot of human rights activists that are not lawyers that have used their spaces to really shift conversations and perceptions. So if you're passionate about human rights, find your space. Use that space. It doesn't have to be in a law class or in a law school. It doesn't have to be using a law degree. You can do it in any form that you want, but just be passionate about human rights, and that would be the starting point.
So with those words, that concludes our MWF Live series for summer 2018. Thank you so much for joining us here at Montpelier and also on the Facebook live stream. And let's have a warm round of applause for our participants today.